here is my creed in a nutshell. Reality is my God. Evidence is my scripture. Big history is my creation story. Ecology is my theology. Integrity is my salvation. And fostering a just and healthy future is my mission. I invite us to work together to foster a just and healthy future.
I have two scripture readings this morning, neither one of them from old texts. The first is a quote from my great mentor, William R. Catton, Jr., who wrote a book called Overshoot, which I consider the most important book I've ever read in my life. Human society is inextricably part of a global, biotic community. And in that community, human dominance has had and is having self-destructive consequences. The second quote from my other great mentor, Thomas Berry, who referred to himself as a geologian. Not a theologian, a geologian. The most difficult transition to make is from an anthropocentric or human-centered to a biocentric or life-centered notion of progress. If there is to be any true progress, then the entire life community must progress. Any progress of the human at the expense of the larger life community must ultimately lead to a diminishment of human life itself.
Not the future we ordered. Staying sane in crazy times. So I'd like to speak this morning on this topic of staying sane in crazy times, staying sane and sober, and on purpose in contracting chaotic times. Because that's what we live in. And I can say pretty confidently that virtually everybody in this room grew up in a context where pretty much you could expect over every year and every decade, there was a sense of more and more. There was a sense that our children would have it better than us and our grandchildren would have it better than them. There was this sense of expansion of possibilities, expansion of opportunities. And we are now living in a world where many of us have come, especially in the last year, to realize that we are looking at a future quite possibly of less and less, of contracting possibilities, of contracting opportunities, and of challenges that our parents and grandparents didn't have to deal with. And so I'd like to offer in this context of not the future we ordered, staying sane in crazy times, I'd like to offer the possibility that we need a big picture. We need a science-based cosmology, a science-based understanding of our creation story, to use religious language, in order to know who we are, where we are, and what's going on right now, and how did we get in this mess? Because if we rely simply on old men and old books for our understanding of reality, we're going to be in deep doo-doo. Now, I realize that's not where Unitarians are, but that's where most of your religious friends and family are. And so I'd like to offer first a big picture, science-based, fact-based, evidence-based understanding of reality that is given by global collective intelligence. Because as our dear friends Joel Primick and Nancy Ellen Abrams in their book, The View from the Center of the Universe, Joel Primick is the guy who discovered the mathematics of dark matter and dark energy, one of the leading cosmologists in the world. His wife is a brilliant writer. The two of them co-authored this book, and they said without a science-based understanding of the big picture, without a science-based cosmology, people have no idea how to think about the big picture. And without a big picture, we are a very small people. So what does our big picture tell us? And what does that big picture tell us? The second point I'll be covering is what does that big picture tell us about the evolutionary significance of religion and the religious significance of science? So I want to talk about the fundamental role of science and religion in the human enterprise. And then finally, okay, given all that, how do we stay sane and sober and wake up on purpose rather than just freaked out or depressed or overwhelmed in crazy contracting times. So first, the big picture as given by science. If you compress the whole history of the universe, the history of everyone and everything, into 100 years, because the history of the universe is 13.82 billion years, and we know that pretty solidly. But 13 billion, 13 million, 13 trillion, these numbers are too difficult. So if we imagine the whole history of the universe as 100 years, on that time scale, okay, if January 1 second after midnight is when the universe began, the Big Bang of the Great Radiance, and today is December 31st, interestingly enough, at midnight, just about to go into the 100th year. At that time scale, at day 2, all the hydrogen was formed and helium nuclei. Galaxies were forming in the first 20 or 30 years, and the bigger galaxies gobbled up other galaxies and became bigger, as our Milky Way did. Our solar system forms at 67 on this time frame. Earth cools below the boiling point of water at 69, and it rains for eons, and all the oceans were formed. The only new water that's been added is some icy comets that have come in. At 71, Earth comes alive, and at 72, some of these bacteria learn to eat the photons of the sun. That's photosynthesis. And then from 72 until now is this long complexity of life. Evolution. When do human beings show up? Well, actually, let's first take dinosaurs. Dinosaurs emerged in May of 98, and they die out in July of 99. Human beings, Homo habilis, walking upright using stone tools, on December 25th of the 99th year. We domesticated fire on December 29th, and we've been speaking in words, symbolic language, for the last day. December 31st of the 99th year. Now, I don't know about you, but if human beings show up, Homo sapiens, symbolic speaking, words speaking humans, if we show up on the last day of a 100-year process, to me it indicates at least the possibility that the whole thing was not meant for us. But if we think that the whole thing was meant for us and act as if it was, we will cause our own extinction. That's why these quotes that I quoted from William Catton and Thomas Berry, what they point to. Human-centeredness, human dominance is self-destructive inherently, necessarily. We are not the masters of nature. Why I love that Julia Roberts video of her speaking as Mother Nature, notice the way that ended. Nature doesn't need people. People need nature. Right? Notice how different that stance is from the idea that nature is a cute bunny that needs our protection. No. We must treat what we today call nature or the universe, we must treat that reality as a thou to be honored and respected and to be ultimately submitted to in terms of our domination. We must have a humble rather than a hubris or arrogant way of relating to primary reality. See, language trips us up. This is one of the things that we learn about this great story, because in the last day of human existence, okay, the last 24 hours, we lived in a harmonious, mutually enhancing relationship with primary reality, whatever our divine or secular names for primary reality may have been. We lived in a mutually enhancing relationship with primary reality for at least 95 to 98% of human experience. That is what evolution has selected for cultures that live sustainably. Sustainability is quite simply being able to live for thousands of years without diminishing or destroying your base, your primary reality. The soil, the forest, the life continues to thrive because it's a mutually enhancing relationship. Unsustainable cultures only began at 11:30, roughly, p.m., the last half hour on the time frame. From midnight until 11:20 to 11:30, we lived in this sustainable way most of human history. We related to primary reality as primary. Again, different cultures use different names, but it's primary reality. In other words, it's the reality, it's not human reality. It's the more than human reality. It's the pre-human reality. It's the reality that if we don't treat it as a thou and respect it and honor it, we will basically foul our own nest and we'll go extinct. See, this is the other thing that this big history, this epic of evolution, this great story, Connie's in my main website, is thegreatstory.org. And all that we mean by the great story is it's the story that includes all stories. All secular and religious stories are part of the great story, part of the epic of evolution. Big history, it's sometimes called. It's the history of everyone and everything. It's physical evolution, biological evolution, and cultural evolution as our first and only globally produced evidence-based creation story. It's collective intelligence, humanity's global collective intelligence. So what we learn about human history is that in this last half hour, we have seen at least 30 to 32, depending upon how you define them, complex city-based civilizations that have all been unsustainable. They have all lived in a way that ultimately caused overshoot. They overshot the carrying capacity that was supporting them. In other words, they took more resources and exuded more waste and took down the timber, the trees, and let the topsoil wash away, or through irrigation, let the soil become too salinated, too much salt, and the civilization collapses. 32 times we've seen the rise of a civilization, it becomes great, and then its own greatness becomes its own undoing. And then there's a dark age. And then another civilization rises, typically takes somewhere between 200 and 500 years for a civilization to become great, and then it takes 1 to 2 centuries to collapse. Collapse is quicker. And we've seen this 30 to 32 times. And what the interesting thing is, we have studied now, there's a lot of scholarship that's been done over the last 125 years about what are the patterns. And interestingly enough, civilizations become great in very different ways. They create very different things, but we all fall the same. And the political insanity unravels, the economic insanity unravels in very similar ways. And when you understand the rise and fall, it's like setting all these civilizations side by side and noticing the common patterns. And when you get that, then you realize, oh, Donald Trump makes total sense. The economic insanity that we see in our world today, globally, the levels of debt make sense. The ecological devastation that has now been wrought globally, not just any one continent, makes sense. And so what this understanding does is it allows you to deal with the craziness and the challenges and the insanity. One author, a friend of ours, calls it the senility of the elites. But you recognize that that's typically the way civilizations unwind. And we are in that pattern. And so part of staying sane in crazy times is readjusting our expectations so that we don't expect more and more, greater and greater, bigger and bigger, wealthier and wealthier. We are now in contraction because energy is primary. Energy was primary when we used timber, wood, as our primary energy source. Energy has been primary throughout all of human history and throughout all of the history of life. And we are now post-peak in terms of oil and coal and natural gas. In terms of the dense, concentrated energy, we're right at the top. And we're now on the downhill slide. Conventional petroleum peaked in 2005. We're now getting the dirtier, more expensive, and more difficult to extract stuff. So it becomes very, very difficult to support a society at our scale of industrialism because oil over $75 a barrel is needed for it to be profitable for oil companies. But then it's really difficult for economies. But oil under $75 a barrel is affordable by us, but the oil companies go bankrupt. And this is what we're seeing. There is no shale oil revolution. Shale is so unprofitable, it's insane. So, we're seeing this. So how do we be with this? Well, one of the things we understand, and this is going to give just some insight into, William Catton calls this the fundamental predicament of humanity. Like this is the predicament that we're in. And there's a distinction between predicaments and problems. See, problems can potentially be solved, but we're used to thinking of things as problems because if you throughout most of the 20th century and much of the 19th century, the more energy and effort that you threw at something, you could solve many problems. So problems can be solved. Predicaments are things that we have to adapt to, live with. For example, death is not a problem that can be solved. Death is a predicament that we have to live with and ultimately die with and adapt to. And so the fundamental predicament of humanity is this. Every bioregion, every island, every continent has a carrying capacity. That is, there's a limit to how much we can take and a limit to how much we can exude in terms of our waste before the systems start breaking down. And globally, and that can be ameliorated if like one region trades with another region for certain resources, but ultimately now we're trading globally and the Earth has a carrying capacity. And we have overshot Earth's carrying capacity many, many, many decades ago. So we are now using like 1.7 Earths worth of materials, but we only have one Earth. So we've overshot. The only reason we can temporarily do that is we're drawing on ancient stored energy. Sunlight, 500 million years of stored carbon energy, we're drawing on that. But as that diminishes, population will also go down. We see this in every species that we've ever studied. So there will be a dieback. Human beings, assuming that we survive some of the climate tipping points, which we may or may not, but assuming we do, I think we will, because all the projections are the idea that we can use coal, oil, and natural gas like we're doing now for the next 70, 80 years. This is insane. It ain't going to happen. It's just not profitable. It's not able to do that. So as this diminishes, it will allow us to do less damage. But nonetheless, we are in this declining process. And so overshoot means that we have overshot the carrying capacity. And so 100 years from now, there's likely to be no more than 2 billion human beings on the planet. And it's not because of some massive starvation, although there will be starvation. It's not because there'll be wars all over the planet, although there will be conflicts and wars. We're within 25 years of living in a post-antibiotic age, where the bugs have beat us. They've evolved beyond us, and where our antibiotics don't do any good, where people die of basic infections like we did before the 1930s. We're very close to that. Now, this sounds like really bad news, but again, if you shift from a human-centered to a life-centered perspective, from an anthropocentric, or human-centered, to an ecocentric, or life-centered, biocentric perspective, it shifts. I call myself an apocalyptimist. An apocalyptimist is someone who basically says, of course we're screwed. Thank God. Because from a life-centered perspective, the sooner that we end this catastrophic destruction of the natural world that industrialism is, the better for the body of life, the better for humans living 1,000, 2,000, 10,000, 15,000, 100,000 years from now. And if we don't go extinct in the next 100 years, human beings are likely to exist for possibly another 1 million or 2 million years before an asteroid takes us out or a supervolcano or whatever. But again, from this 100-year time scale, if we imagine just the next year on the cosmic century timeline, so we go out 101 years, that's going out 140 million years from now. Earth will continue to spin 140 million years from now. Earth and the sun will continue to go around the Milky Way galaxy. Life will continue. Earth will continue. The solar system will continue. The galaxy will continue. The universe will continue. Humans won't exist 140 million years from now. No mammal our size exists that long. And so Connie, my wife, she's not a gambling woman, but she says, even if we cause the worst destruction and we cause our own extinction and many other species too, she said her money is on raccoons to be the next self-reflexive intelligence. That is, to be the next creature that comes to know that it knows. Develops technology, because see, raccoons have the manual dexterity to develop technology. Dolphins are really, really smart. Orcas are really, really smart. Elephants are really, really smart. And they communicate in complex ways just like us. But they don't have they can't create tools that extend their powers and their understanding. Raccoons are likely to be able to do that. And one of our favorite authors, John Michael Greer, wrote a blog post called The Next 10 Billion Years. He actually agrees with Connie. He thinks that the next technological species is likely to be raccoons, 10 or 20 million years from now. And he says that the third technological species, 100 million years from now, again, that's just within the next year on the cosmic century timeline, right, is likely to be the descendants of the crows. And because the crows are already into flying, right, and because 100 million years from now there'll be a replenishment of fossil fuels, so they'll have dense, concentrated energy, the crows are going to get to the moon. And because hubris or arrogance is the downfall of virtually all species and civilizations, the great existential crisis, but also the blessing for the crows when they get to the moon is they're going to realize some now extinct Earth species beat them to it. And maybe they don't have a favored relationship with primary reality after all, right? So this big picture helps us know who we are, that we are not separate from nature. We are the result of 13.8 billion years of unbroken evolution now becoming conscious of itself. Human beings are literally the universe becoming aware of itself. We're nature uncovering its own nature. A human being looking through a telescope is the universe looking at itself and just gawking, like, whoa. A biology student looking through a microscope is the planet Earth, learning with awareness, with consciousness, how it's functioned unconsciously and instinctually for billions of years. We are nature. We're not separate from it. But if we don't treat primary reality as primary, we cause big problems. So that's the big picture. Lots more I can say, lots more I will say on Tuesday night about that. The second question is, or the second point is, what's the primary role of science and religion? And both are needed for us to survive into the future. The two fundamental questions that every culture has needed to address are what's real and what's important, or how things are and which things matter. Science is all about how things are, what's real. Religion, if it's doing its job, if it's not asleep at the wheel, which it has been for quite some time now, but religion is all about accurately identifying what's important, and then basically there's three things that religion has always done in sustainable societies. The first is to interpret everything in a pro-future way. See, everything can be interpreted in either a pro-future or an anti-future way. Even our concepts of God. Thinking of God as a supernatural being who lives off the planet and outside the universe, who blesses some and smites others, is an anti-future way of thinking about primary reality. Thinking of reality, thinking of God as reality with a personality, doesn't matter whether you believe in reality or not, right? Put it there. Imagine the universe with a voice, the universe with an authoritative voice. It doesn't matter whether you believe in the universe or not, right? But we better listen to what the universe is telling us, otherwise we're going to cause our own extinction. So whatever the word God means, it can't be less than the universe plus, nature plus, the biosphere plus. Plus what? Plus at least an authoritative voice. And if people want to have otherworldly beliefs beyond that, whatever, but it's got to include the universe. It's got to include nature. Otherwise, it's not primary reality. It's some illusion. It's delusion. And everything else, progress. If we define progress and success in human-centered ways like GDP, gross domestic product, or gross national product, if we define success and progress in human-centered ways, we'll cause our own extinction. That's anti-future. The only progress that makes sense, as the two quotes that I read, are life-centered definitions of progress. How well is the soil doing decade by decade? How well are the forests doing decade by decade? How well are the fisheries doing decade by decade? How much carbon is in the atmosphere decade by decade? That's the only sane and sustainable measure of progress. All human-centered measures of progress are self-terminating. They will end up in our own extinction. And so religion, the role of religion, if it's not comatose, is to interpret everything in a pro-future way. So that's a great calling. We all get to participate in the death and resurrection of religion. Religion needs a born-again experience. And the nice thing is, it's going to happen whether we want it to or not, because we have 32 examples of previous civilizations, and religions evolve and become great. And towards the end, in the last century or so of great civilizations, religion starts to be looked at because what happens is rationality emerges. We don't have one rational age. We've had many rational ages. We go from mythic to intellectual, to rational, to where the rational sort of like postmodernism starts to eat itself up, and then there's a decline, and then you get back to mythic again. And then we see this. So religions don't tend to survive the dark ages in between different societies. So we will see the dying of religion. But there can be a transformation. There can be a pro-future Christianity, a pro-future Islam, a pro-future Hinduism, a pro-future Buddhism. They don't have to be anti-future. But what it's going to require is key members of those faiths to reinterpret their mythic stories and their mythic concepts in a pro-future way. That's the great work that religion will be about in the next 100 years, the next 50 years, hopefully. And that's the work where Unitarian Universalists can be at the cutting edge, because we're one of the only religious traditions, certainly in the West, that's not tied to old men and old books. We're grounded first and foremost in global collective intelligence, that is science, evidence. So we have a profound role to play, even though we're very small. I call that the evidential Reformation. 2017 is the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation. That was when we Westerners, started valuing old books, not just old men. Well, now we see that both of those are inadequate. We need to value all forms of evidence, scientific evidence, historic evidence, and cross-cultural evidence as divine revelation. That is, as reality revealing the way things really are. So religion, if it's doing its job, interprets everything in a pro-future way. It insists on limits. One of the most important concepts ecologically is limits, that limits are sacred. And the idea of limitlessness makes total sense. I want to come back to what I didn't finish before, which is William Catton's understanding of the fundamental predicament of humanity. Europe had achieved saturation level. Europe was achieving population pressure. And because of that, the forests were being denuded, the soil was being washed away, and there was severe social problems in Europe. And then an entire new hemisphere was discovered. Right? Now, it was already fully occupied, but it was discovered by Europeans. And because our bugs, our bacteria, our diseases went ahead of most of us and wiped out 90% of the North and South and Central Americans, it seemed to be, from the European perspective, an uninhabited continent, full of resources that had been exhausted in Europe and Asia. Timber out the gazoo, animals of every kind, soil rich, thick soil. And so we had this sense of limitlessness, because what we know from population studies, overshoot studies, is that whenever any species all of a sudden is exposed to or opens up into a habitat it didn't have access to before, its population goes skyrocketing. And if you measure the hormones, there's this sense of elatedness. It's like life is good. Right? It's the age of exuberance. So America had the age of exuberance. We had so much, and then when coal and oil and natural gas, this energy. So there was this natural, inevitable sense of limitless possibilities, limitless opportunities. And we exported the mindset of limitlessness to the rest of the world. So now the people in China and India and Bangladesh and everywhere else expect to live like middle-class Americans. And yet it would take 6 to 7 planets of resources for them to live like us. It's not sustainable. It's insane thinking, but that's what our advertising industry is putting to the world. So the fundamental predicament of humanity, it's not a problem that can be solved, it's a predicament we have to adapt to and live with and evolve with, is that we actually live in a carrying capacity deficit world. We don't have enough carrying capacity for 7 billion human beings. We probably only have enough for maybe 2 billion. And yet we have a carrying capacity surplus mindset and institutions that we've exported to the rest of the world. So we have a carrying capacity surplus mindset and institutions living in a carrying capacity deficit world. That's the fundamental predicament of humanity. The other thing that religion needs to do, in addition to insisting on limits, that's what religion, tribal religions, sustainable religion was all about taboos. You have to honor the limits of nature, the grace limits. There are grace limits at every scale of reality. The planet has grace limits, and what I mean by grace limits is that, think about a marriage. There are grace limits to every marriage. That is, there are conditions in which that marriage is flourishing for both people. But there are certain limits in that marriage that if those limits are exceeded, you may lose the grace of that relationship. And the same is true of our bioregions, our continents. There's a limit to how much we can take, a limit to how much we can exude. There's a limit of how much denial we can move into. And so insisting on limits is a fundamental role. And we need science to tell us what those limits are. That's why both are needed. Religion has been asleep at the wheel for several hundred years, largely because of a human-centered worldview. Once we started thinking of the universe as a complex clock, and that God was the clockmaker outside a clockwork universe, that did two things. One, it trivialized God. God was no longer synonymous with reality. God was now a clockmaker outside a clockwork universe. That if you believe in the clockmaker, you're a theist. And if you disbelieve in the clockmaker, you're an atheist. The theist-atheist debate is one of the great insanities of our time. Because you got all these people debating whether or not God is real or whether or not God exists, when the one real God, namely primary reality, whatever you want to call the biosphere, we've been living out of right relationship to, and we are now about to experience consequences of biblical proportion. And yet we're debating about whether or not God is real. So the third thing that religion and science need to work together on is, in addition to interpreting everything in a pro-future way and insisting on limits, is to ensure the consequences are captured. Individuals, corporations, and nation states that do well to the larger common good need to benefit. And the more good they do, the more they should benefit. So they're incentivized to do as much good as possible. But individuals, corporations, and nation states that disregard or harm the common good should be taxed or penalized, or there should be moral strictures, so that it becomes in the self-interest of individuals and corporations and nation states to do the right, just, ecological thing. And it becomes also in their self-interest to not do the unjust, unecological thing. Every sustainable society that we know of in human history aligned self-interest at multiple levels. To have an economic system where it's possible and it's profitable for think of nesting dolls, like Russian nesting dolls. To have an economic system where it's possible and it's profitable for a subset of the whole to benefit at the expense of the whole, you should be able to open up a dictionary and see insanity and see that as an example. It's insane. It's crazy. Yet this is what we have because we've had a human-centered worldview rather than a life-centered. So it's to insist on consequence capture. So let me take just the last few minutes. How do we stay sane and sober? And I'm not talking about tonight. If you want to go party tonight, it's the end of the year, go on, do it, whatever. But I'm saying in a general rule, how do we stay sane, sober, and inspired to action in the face of chaotic, challenging, contracting times? First is to attend to that which matters most. Your own personal integrity. If you've got addictions, if your kids or grandkids have addictions, it's important to help deal with that. Because one of the things we know in every contracting society, Plato wrote about this 2,500 years ago. In contracting societies, addictions get higher. There's a direct correlation to contracting civilizations, contracting empires, and addictions go rampant. So there are lots of different ways of dealing with that. The other is to attend to your families and your friends. Our family and friends are who we're going to rely on in difficult times. If you are not aware that there is a possibility that in the next 2 years, and possibly a lot sooner than that, we could be in a condition like 1929 or 1933, like the Great Depression, you're not paying attention. That could be a possibility, and it's your friends and family and your local community where real resilience resides. That's where, see, this is the thing, it sounds scary, and it is, and yet we will see right now there is an epidemic worldwide, but let's just speak about America. There's an epidemic. Tens of millions of young men are addicted to internet porn and internet gaming. When their societies need them, they won't be able to. So, local, and finally get used to using less energy, less stuff, and less stimulation. We're all going to have to do it anyway. but getting used to less energy, less stuff, and less stimulation. It's what John Michael Greer, one of our authors that we sell, calls collapse now and avoid the rush. And then finally, find the place where your joy and the world's needs intersect. With what lights you up, what gives you joy, what gives you energy, and what your community's needs or the world's needs, where those intersect, where your joy and the world's needs intersect, that's your calling, that's your mission, that's where you can make a difference in a way that blesses you, that nourishes you. And what's exciting, I'll leave on this point, what's exciting about this is it's not just your good works. Haven't there been people who have made a profound positive difference in your life because of their lousy example? They were a total jerk, and yet you made some positive choice as a result. Now, do you honestly think that you haven't been blessing others in the same way? So again, attend to that which matters most, family, friends, local community. Get used to less energy, less stuff, and less stimulation. Find the place where your joy and the world's needs intersect. And know that you're not separate from the universe. You are part of this grand, majestic, amazing thing. And that even when our species goes extinct, which it will, next 50 years, next 2 million years, whatever, it's going to go extinct at some point, we are still part of this incredible, majestic, amazing process that is holy if anything is holy.